Cool. So does anyone have anything to add to the agenda?
Model view controller. I guess sort of an overview of how to organize code for a single page application.
Okay. So do you want to go into like just the architectural piece, or do you want to like dive deep into? Because there's also a video available for you to watch if on the YouTube channel.
Yeah, just sort of the architecture.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool. Damn, I'm forgetting your name.
Jay.
Okay.
Why and I are wondering about the actual creating of the session, like the req.session.user equals user, what exactly that does and how that creates the session.
req.session.user equal to user.
Yeah.
So essentially how express session works?
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely something going on under the hood.
Okay. How express session equal to user? Okay.
No, they're not. But we don't.
Can you go over like if I have like cities and then a city ID and then post and then post ID, how I can get access to the city ID and the route. I'm like, oh, I want to know what the city ID is when I'm working with the post.
Gotcha. So the city, so the post is associated to a city.
If I were to organize something like that and there was information in the URL.
Gotcha.
That's not a
So
query.
it's kind of like a nested resource.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like not a query parameter, but it's there in the URL.
Gotcha. Cool. Anybody else? Sally, you have something to add?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on Sally's. I have some. Yeah, I definitely. I selfishly want as much time on that as well.
Okay. Photos.
That's a lot to say.
Oh, really specific today.
Okay, cool. Let's just get started. So I'm going to use my again.
So excited.
Paid for this. I got new software too, which is supposed to be way better. Sketchbook Pro. Oh yeah,
That's like high school Googling, right? Like when you're
Use your pen on your mouse pad?
No, this is tablet.
Oh, you have a whole separate thing.
Yeah.
that's the way common.
That'd be cool if you used last time.
That would be super cool.
How do I make it a full screen? It's kind of weird.
Isn't it?
Image. Canvas. Yeah, 2000.
You press Control Plus.
No.
And can you put just so in the future, that we I don't know legality of this, but
Okay. Cool. And I want. All right. So the model view controller is essentially a design pattern you use on your app, right? And in most web apps, you're trying to access some data, perform some operation on it, and send it to the user and display it on like some UI. right? So if you look at so the model view controller is dividing that set of operations into specific domains. So you're creating something called a model. So this is a model here. Let me make this thinner.
So it needs to work in a strong game.
Yeah. Man, there's too many settings. Maybe use a pencil. All right, so it's too small.
That sounds fair. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a model, right? And the responsibility of the model is to just work with data. So behind the scenes, there could be some sort of a database. So this is a sign for a database, by the way. So this is a DB, right? So behind the scenes, the model can use a DB. It can use a file. It can use an HTTP service, so another service like Facebook or something to get data from, right? So that's the model layer's responsibility. So the model layer is completely separate, right? Anybody can sort of call the model and request for data, saying that I want to get data about a user, or I want to update data about a user. So think of model as an abstraction layer for data. So it's an abstraction for data, right? And then essentially the data is coming. I'm going to extract some data, and then I'm going to send it along to the view, right? The view is could be the browser, right? Or rather, it could be sent to the browser, because view is nothing but generation of HTML, right? And the HTML can be rendered either on a browser, it could be rendered on the phone, it could be rendered on a TV. That is just the device on which it is being shown, right? So the view could be anything. So most cases it's HTML, because when you're doing server-side rendering, you know what server-side rendering is? Right, you're generating the content on the server side. So the server is responsible for sending the whole content to the view layer. So there's a view which gets in some data, and then the view layer will use under the hood you would have templates, right? And these templates plus data will give you some sort of HTML, right? So templates have holes in them, which are filled by the data that you provide to the templates. And together, when you combine them, you kind of get HTML, right? And this HTML goes back here and is sent sent in the response. So that's the view's responsibility to just create the HTML, right? It doesn't even actually know it's HTML. It just creates a string, right? Because HTML is nothing but a string, right? But somebody else has to send the response back. So actually, in this diagram, we haven't even spoken about a request or a response. These are just responsibilities of the model layer and the view layer. So the model layer is responsible for fetching and storing and updating data. The view layer is responsible for just generating the HTML, right? Anything to do with the UI. But somebody has to send request for data and then send it to the view, right? There has to be this delegator in the middle. That delegator is the controller. So this is a controller here. So the controller will say, find all posts, right? It'll tell the model layer to give me posts, and the model layer will respond back with some posts, right? Once it responds back with the posts, the controller will then send the view layer the posts, and then the view layer will respond back with the HTML for all posts. And then the controller layer will have the data that it needs to send back to the person who made the request. So essentially, somewhere behind the scene, or rather somewhere on the other side of the world, there is a user, right? There's a smiley face here saying, going to the control. Essentially, this is like behind your the internet, right? This is the internet line, and this is your server here. Your server contains like your model, view, and controller, your whole app essentially. So here, somewhere along the line, the user is saying, I wanna see, see all my posts. That's the user's action that they want to perform. So they click on some button, and then the request is made to the server. And then the request goes down to the controller. The controller goes and goes to the model layer. The model sends back the posts. The post is sent to the view layer. The view responds to the HTML. Now the controller sends it back here with the response, right? HTTP response essentially. And this HTTP response goes back to the user. That's like sort of the whole flow of stuff that's going on. But the key thing here is like this discrete separation, right? This model layer is separate, the controller is separate, and the view is separate. So the view has no idea that the controller even exists, or even the model layer exists. Similarly, the model has no idea that the controller and the view exists. The controller knows the model layer and the view layer exists. So the controller is the only person that is delegating. So that's what MVC is. Questions about this? So another cool thing about model layer is that I can swap in and swap out how I access the data, right? So the controller doesn't really know that it's using a database. For all practical purposes, I could be using a file, right? Because I don't need a database. It's just static data. But the controller doesn't know about it. So tomorrow, if I want, I can replace the file, and I would add a database to be more flexible. Or I can replace the database and just make an external call to Facebook. And the controller doesn't know about it. Questions?
I don't know, they probably say, oh yeah, let's say that.
How's it holding attention, Jay?
Good to see like how everything is separated.
Right, and the other thing in Express apps is you automatically get that separation because of the folder structure. Right, we already have the views folder. We already have, the routes folder, which are essentially the controller, and we already have you're used to adding a DB folder, but instead I'm suggesting people creating a models folder. And then inside that, you can have a DB folder, which is like an implementation detail for your model. Cool. Any last thoughts, questions? Yeah, Samaya.
Why are we right now the transaction, whatever you suggested, that we put all our controller stuff in a server folders? Why not collect controller?
You can. It's I've just seen like node projects people call it server. Yeah. So like Ruby on Rails, for example, it's called controller.
So inside the controllers folder, you'll have could you have a server folder with a routes folder inside, or would it just be better to have a routes folder inside the controller folder?
So if you're calling it controller, then it would just so I wouldn't recommend putting a server inside controller, because the server is outside of the controller. Server is like the whole thing, and then inside the server you have a controller. Also, you have like the idea of middlewares in Node, so that feels a little like above controllers, which is why I suggest having the server folder, right? So this is server. So this is a server folder, and then inside here I have routes, and then inside here you could have a middleware, right? Because middlewares are sort of not routes. They're just functions that get triggered in the path of the request. And in the path of the request, you may have the route handler function, or you may have middleware function. So so controller is just like a name, right? Like it's something that controls the flow of information from like the view and the data.
So your suggestion is to have a server folder instead of a controller folder.
No, I'm suggesting not having a controller folder, just having a server folder.
If I'm doing just front end app, should I have, I guess, different files, like one file that's more of a controller, like a route kind of folder that's like doing all the fetch and the API requests and such, and then another JavaScript file that's doing any manipulation of the data for the view?
Right. So I mean, when you're saying it's like a single page app,
Yeah.
like everything is on the front end.
Yeah. So I guess I'm asking, how would you organize that within?
Yeah. Oops, what happened here? No. It's gone. Okay, can I delete this? Is this good? Okay, so flip book. Okay, savage. It would essentially be the same thing, but in the front end, you don't want to create multiple folder structures because then you or multiple files, because, or rather you could, but in the end, you just want one file, right? Because the way you load files in your front end is you have a script tag, right, with your source equal to the name of the file. Right? Essentially, you want one file which is like the bundle.js. Right, but you may want to organize your files into many different files, which is why you may use something like Webpack, which which takes like a bunch of 10 files and then combines them into one file, and you just have to provide the entry point of the file. But yeah, like your original question of like MVC stuff. So your model layer becomes your HTTP, right? So you, inside your model layer, you would be using, you would be making HTTP requests to your backend, right, to fetch the data, the HTTP fetch. And this would be like your server making, the server API, and your model layer is just like making fetch calls to the server to get the data, because the model layer is only like responsible for the data, right? Where do I get the data? How do I get the data? And how do I set the data, right? That's the responsibility. So the model layer's responsibility is again the same, which is to expose a way to access data and save data and update data. Right, so that's the model's responsibility. It just so happens that the place where the data is stored is in some database in some other server. Right, so you have to, the only way to access it is using HTTP. So you have to make HTTP fetch calls. Right, before in your other case you were making you were using Postgres and making PG promise requests to fetch data. In your regular case, where your database is in the same place as your server. But right now you're on the browser, right? So essentially all of this world, or rather this world, is the browser, right? This is the client side. And the server is the place which has the DB, right? And this is somewhere else. This is, let's say, on Amazon somewhere. Right? And this is, you are in Oakland here. Right? If you're in Oakland and you're on your computer and your browser, you have some JavaScript code that is going to have to make an HTTP request to get to Amazon. Right? Is everyone with me so far?
Yeah.
So the only way to do that is using an HTTP request, and you typically do that using fetch, right? Because fetch is like the modern way to make asynchronous calls. So you have like the fetch method, so you would get to a get for getting requests, post for like creating data, put for updating data, and delete for deleting data. Right? So that's like getting the data. So once you have the data, so you do have essentially a controller here too. And the controller is doing pretty much the same thing, which is asking the model layer for data, saying find posts, let's say, the same example, and then the controller, the model layer responds with posts. Right, so the model layer will like make the HTTP request to get all posts. The HTTP request will either successfully respond or it will fail, and then we get back the posts. So now the controller has the posts. Now it needs to send the posts to the view layer. Right, and the view layer is responsible for updating the DOM. So in this case, the view layer is different than in the case where it was server-side rendering, because the server-side rendering would combine a template and combine data and give you the HTML. But here, since you're manually maintaining the DOM, you have to do like DOM manipulation. Right? You have to DOM manipulate and say, okay, I have these 5 posts. Then I have to like go to a place where I have a list of all posts and append these 5 posts to those, that area. That has to happen manually. You are responsible for it. Nobody's going to do it for you. And the view does it, and then that's it. There's no response which needs to come back, and you don't have to return the thing. There's no like nobody waiting for the request, because there is no request. Everything happens like on the browser. The only request that gets fired off is the asynchronous requests for the data. Once the data comes back, it's your responsibility to send it to the view layer, and the view layer can update itself. So again, this is like responsibilities. The view has no idea where the data is coming from. Right? The view layer only gets the data as an argument, as a parameter, and it knows what to do. So I would have a function like update, or maybe not update, but like add posts, and it would just take posts. Right? That's how it. So this was a function. Then I would do some sort of DOM manipulation here to update posts. Where these posts came from, the view layer has no idea, because it could have come from the sky, or it could have come from the hell. Anyway.
So the view layer would consist of an HTML file and a JavaScript.
No, the view layer is just a JavaScript function. There is no HTML there. So the add posts is basically doing something like document dot find, whatever, what is it called, query selector, and then finding the place which has posts, and then doing an append. So there's no, you can say there's HTML, but like you are manually generating the HTML. Like there's no .html file anywhere.
So would you recommend, if you're doing a single page app, not having an HTML file at all to start with?
I mean, you have a basic HTML file, which is like index.html, which loads your bundle.js, which has this thing in here. But that's about it.
So you wouldn't even have any like actual hard-coded HTML?
Maybe like your layout may be there. Right, like maybe your header and your footer. So like the meat of the app, which is like the actual data, you have to wait for it to come back from your server. Right. So on first page load, the empty app would be there, but like you would wait for the request to finish, and once that finishes, then you have to update the main page. So does that make sense? Any questions about this? Okay. Okay, so how does express session work? So your question was how is this working? Like what happens under the hood?
Yeah.
So what is request.session?
The entire.
Alex.
So request.session is you're making a request to the session.
You're making a request to the session.
Never mind. I'm gonna not answer actually. I'm curious what your answer is. So like, it has like the session ID which connects it to the cookie, and like user ID, and maybe other stuff on it. Like in this case, you might be storing the whole user in request session user.
Okay.
This is like data about the person who's logged in right now.
Okay.
Stored on the request.
Gotcha. So in Express session, when we're in development mode, it uses like a in-memory store, right, to store all the sessions. Does everyone know that? So Express session, when we're not using a session store, by default, it uses an in-memory session store, which is why when you restart your server, you lose your logins, which you may have had. Like when you may have logged in, and then if you restart your server and you go back to the page, it'll ask you to relog in because it's lost that session. Because it's storing everything in memory, right? So what is that in-memory thing may give you a hint, which is it's probably using a large object to store the whole session, right? So there's the session ID is the key, and the session is just another object. The value is another object. And the session itself, the session ID is stored in a cookie on the browser. So why do we use cookies? Yeah,
They're cached in your browser. Whereas if you make a session, it's in memory store. So like you said, if you restart your server, the server.
Right, but can I use Express session without a cookie?
Yes, because it's now built in.
Yeah, I just called
How would I use Express session without a cookie?
Without a cookie. You can't use request.session without a cookie.
Why do I need a cookie?
Because the browser needs to know that, because HTTP is stateless, so the view doesn't know that, it won't remember that session. So in order to remember that session, there needs to be a cookie as a reminder to send back and forth.
Right. So whenever I set a cookie on the browser, so if I'm roam.com and I'm setting a cookie on the browser, every time a request is made, because I set the cookie, that cookie is going to be sent back to me. That's how cookies work. It's a way to sort of have state in the browser and send that to the server. So HTTP is stateless, which is correct, but you want a place where you can store information, right? And which can persist for a significant amount of time. So when you say I have when I've logged in, that means you want to be authenticated for like a certain amount of time, and the only way you can know that you're authenticated if there is some place which is got some information stored, right? So a cookie is what you use to set. You can set something in the cookie that will help us determine whether the user is logged in or not. So I will set a cookie from roam.com with some value in the cookie, and then next time the request comes in to me, that cookie is going to come back to me, because all cookies are which are created by the website or the domain is going to be sent back on subsequent requests. So Express session will use we'll just save the session ID in the cookie. right? So if it only has a session ID, then where is the session stored?
Store on the server.
Okay, it's stored on the server. So then it will use the session ID to fetch the session. So kind of like a find by session ID. Right?
So what is the session? Like what's in
It's just an object.
It's like private data, right? It's like data that you don't want on the cookie because you don't want other people having access to it.
Right. Also, the cookie is encrypted, so you're being kind of a little more secure. Just like even if somebody decrypts my cookie, they only get like the cookie session ID, which isn't a big deal, right? But there's this other library called cookie session, which stores the whole session on the cookie. So there's no like server-side storage at all, which is easier, but a little less secure. But know the distinction between the two of them. So if Express session is storing the sessions on the server, then the session ID is used to look up the session in the server, right? It's kind of like the key and the lock. So the key is the session ID, which is used to look, I guess key lock is not a very good analogy, but something like that, where you have the way to look up something, right? Kind of like an object. So if you have an object and if you have a key, you can check the object and get the value associated to that key. Right? An object is nothing but a key value store. So I can look things up by keys. So the key here is a session ID. So I can look up the session by the session ID. Right? So far, everyone with me? So now once I have the session, I can manipulate it because it's nothing but an object. Right? So request.session is essentially the session that has been looked up for me, based on the session ID that was sent to me by the cookie.
what part of the code does the thing where it creates the session in the first place and sends the cookie to the browser?
When you initialize Express session.
So like when you require it?
No, you call session of something with some arguments, right? Saying the expires at and
okay, so it's the app.use.
App.use, yeah. So that's a middleware, right?
Okay.
So every time a request comes in, it checks to see if there's a cookie called SID, connect SID. If it's not, it creates the cookie and sends it back. And then it creates an entry with that ID in its session store. And then subsequent times when the cookie comes back, it'll look up the session with that cookie, and then it'll add it to the request. And then you have that thing there, and then you can modify it. And then at the end of it, it saves it back. So whatever modification you do, it's saved into the saved back into the store
via that middleware.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Or rather, it's not saved back because it's like a shared object.
Right.
Because it's an object and it's not immutable, if you modify it, the original thing gets modified as well. If they were using immutable JS, it would not. But did that make sense? So like it's the same reference to the object. So if you modify the object, it changes. Which is why you can get away with this. But if you're using a Postgres session store, which is like Connect PG Simple, which is in the in-memory store, has anyone used that in Express Session? So instead of using the default session store, you can give it like a different session store, which is like I want to save all my sessions in Postgres, in a Postgres table. So if you have done that, you'll notice that you cannot do this. You cannot say request.session.user equal to user, because request.session is stored in Postgres. So you need a different way of setting your session. So they give you a callback call. I don't know, I forget the thing, but there's a different way to do it because this is an asynchronous operation, right? It happens after some time because it's in Postgres.
That's how I did it when I was using Connect PG Simple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you able to see in Postgres that your data was there?
Mm-hmm. But it's different with Passport. So it's like it doesn't store the whole user, and it's like request.session.passport.user. It just has the ID.
But then Postgres, there would be some sort of a callback function that tells you that the session was saved, right? Because if you save something in Postgres, you are essentially using a promise or a callback function.
Yeah, I don't have it memorized. Maybe there's more to it, but I definitely have that in my code.
Okay. Yeah.
Is there an advantage to using Passport? Would you recommend using?
I mean, eventually, yeah, because it's it's tested, it's been maintained for many years, so you're not redoing everything from scratch. But understanding how it works under the hood is useful. So that way, when you get tripped, Passport sends like a weird error message, you know what's going on.
Just for a bit of background here, we had the device development program already set up.
Because also, like, you have to encrypt it yourself, right? Like, you're using bcrypt, but Passport does it all for you. Or I forget. You have to use bcrypt when you're
I
using
used
Passport.
Bcrypt with Passport.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay. So then don't use it. If you're using like a simple authentication, but if you're using something like OAuth, maybe it's a little bit more useful.
Just trying to actually transfer.
Okay, so how's this doing? Danielle.
Most really good. I was coming up with one other question, which is, so when that middleware creates a session on the server, is there any information inside of the session other than it has an ID? And then is it basically an empty object?
So it has like expiry, like when does the session expire? It has, I think it has the cookie name too.
But it doesn't know who the user is yet. That has to come from the browser.
Yeah, it doesn't know anything about the user. It's just like, oh, there is a session ID, and I am the session associated to that ID. That's about it. And whatever is in there is up to you. So you have to modify the session to put stuff that is interesting to you, right?
Feels good.
Okay. Nested resources, Sally. So you're saying that you have cities/1, right? And then this is going to list the city and then the associated posts for the city.
And then there would be like another slash. Yeah.
And then
like
if you want to go to a specific post,
yeah.
then you would go to post/3.
Yeah, and since like in the router,
Mm-hmm.
the city's :ID is in a whole other file. So when I get the city's :ID, the :ID part as a variable, one of the posts.
I see what you mean.
The 3 is another :ID thing.
So when you mount your, I guess I see your dilemma. So when you're saying when you mount your file and you say app.use, you can say / and then you can say posts, right? But in your posts, all your routes would begin. Actually, no, you can just do this app.posts. So you're saying this doesn't translate. So if I have a .id or a city ID,
Look at it real quick. So I have like at the bottom of my city router, I have a /ID/posts, and then it says use the post router.
and then
So there's no cities.
so where does this come from?
That's in the city router. At the bottom of the city router, it has like this whole thing except for this because this is in the.
So you have app.use / and then you have cities, or you have /cities,
So that's in the router
right?
above the cities router, yeah. And then the cities router itself has this basically, but without that because this is in the router above it.
Okay, so
Here, I'll
this
show
is
it to you. So this is my city router, and this is working. But I just don't know how to get access to this /ID in the post router.
Right, because the post router now has, so I think the query parameters, the URL parameters do not translate from one file to another.
Oh, I haven't tried something called URL parameters.
This is a URL parameter.
Oh, okay.
The ID, so the request.params is essentially URL params because it's the parameters embedded in the URL.
Oh, okay. I haven't tried, like,
so
I'll be honest, I haven't like spent much time trying this yet. I just thought I'd ask you first.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I would try maybe like Googling how to do that, like, nested parameters in Node. If that doesn't happen, then just do this /post, and then in your post route, you'll have to append everything with /city, /ID, /post, /post ID.
Okay, got it.
That are not post ID, but then ID.
So I'll just put like a slash, and then I'll have like a couple of different parameters in the next router. Got it.
That makes sense?
I think so, yeah.
So anyone know what nested resources are? What's a nested resource?
Multiple resources together.
But why are they nested?
With a child?
Right, parent-child relationship.
Okay, so there's a relationship. And what is the relationship?
Between the resources?
They're associated somehow.
Yeah.
They're associated.
What is the association? What are the different kinds of relationships?
Well, the one-to-one,
Okay.
one-to-many, and then many.
Okay. So,
Many
so in the
posts,
case of cities and posts, what is it?
many posts per one city?
Yeah.
Many to one.
So one city has many posts. So that's usually, so you have the primary resource, then the primary resource ID, and then you have secondary resource, and the secondary resource ID. That's usually the nesting. And this is the, so this primary resource has many secondary resources. So that's the relationship.
Is it kind of related to the question Jeff was asking yesterday about how to set up his?
Yeah, so they're working on the same project. So the benefit of this is in the URL, you automatically get the ID of the resource that you're trying to associate this secondary resource to, right? Because you can just extract it from the URL. And then the URL kind of reads well too. Because you're like, oh, it's the first resources. I'm trying to add something to this and associate it automatically. That's what a nested resource is. Cool.
Go back to the express session thing.
You want to go back to the express session thing?
Yeah, I
Okay.
have one more question. So I'm curious, I guess, how logging in fits in with all that. It seems as though there is a session created as soon as there's a request at all to the page, but we just don't see it because there's no cookie created before you log in.
Say that again?
Like I definitely don't see a cookie on the browser until we log in.
Mm-hmm.
So when is a session created and when is a cookie created and why does logging in do that?
So session and a cookie are connected, right?
Uh-huh.
So the cookie contains the session ID.
So is the cookie sent as soon as the session is created?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How/why does logging in create the session? But that's just doing the req.session.user equals user. Like we already have the middleware For
So whenever you say
every
req.session equal to something, the response is being modified to set the cookie. So you can actually check. I wonder if you can look at the response. So when you log in, instead of redirecting to a page, just render like a different page. And if you see the response, you will see a set cookie in the headers. So which is sent back from your server. The set cookie will contain the cookie name and the value of the cookie. And that value will be an encrypted session ID.
I guess what I'm saying is if the middleware is in general for the entire app,
Mm-hmm.
why does it not actually create the session until we do a login?
If the middleware is, so the middleware is just checking to see, so the middleware does, I think probably the middleware is just looking to see if we have a cookie, and if we do, then it's fetching the cookie, fetching the session, right? And then you have another middleware that's like, if request.session does not exist, then redirect user to the login page. Right? You have that middleware. Otherwise, it wouldn't. There wouldn't be a check to see if the session exists. That check is being explicitly added by you. So now, when you redirect the user back to the session login page, when the user successfully logs in, then you say request.session equal to user, or request.session.user equal to user.
And why is it that saying req.session.user equal to user creates the session?
Because I think request.session is a good question. Let's look it up instead of speculating.
Are you calling session? So if you get a request.
Yeah, so maybe express session.
Or maybe you're accessing like the session object, because like when you set a value to an object, well, you have to hear my computation. I'm just guessing.
Yeah, there's something else going on because it's informing the response that there is no session, and hence when you create a new session, also create the set cookie, add this, call the set cookie function on the response. So does anyone have a project with authentication already working? We can hack around with that. Maybe I do. Let's see. Coding authentication. Right. Oh wow. Okay. So can I clone somebody's project which has authentication working? Maybe from last week.
Yes. Sure. If you go to my GitHub.
What's your GitHub handle?
Dennis Yellis. Oh, that's true. It doesn't have cookie version. Never mind. It has cookie version. Yeah.
Does anyone has Express Session project that's working? Sally?
My GitHub is LVIKKISA. There's like a contact. What is it called? Let me actually go to my GitHub.
Contact snapshot?
Yeah, the testing snapshot, I think, is that also with contacts? I think that one has authentication. I mean, my project right now has it, but it might be broken in other ways. Of Rome.
Okay.
I don't have it memorized which ones are.
So we're gonna try and add some logging to Express session.
Let me check if that's the one that has on.
I think it does because it is 444 and that's the opcode.
Might want to just, I don't know how you search it, so you might want to just use the server one with the off stuff is in an off branch
Oh, that's right.
for the specs.
Oh, I see. Okay, I can just do a git fetch.
I'm pretty sure testing.
Oh,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure the testing snapshot has it. That one's newer.
so which one's that?
The LG testing snapshot. Yeah. Well, maybe I should check. Sorry.
No worries. Is it on the master branch?
I'm just looking for my packages. Session. Yeah, this one has Express session.
To master?
Yeah.
Okay.
And connect PG simple. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so let's look at this. I guess we can search for cookie in the project to see what we find. What do we search in? Yeah, this is one. So cookie. This dot cookie. That looks promising. So I need a env file.
Oh, let's see.
Database URL.
So I think
Or should I like send it to you in the
Yeah, send it to me on the chat.
Don't look at the chat screen,
okay.
I need. This is the.
Okay. DB users. I don't care about that. Sessions does not exist. So I need to run.
You need to run the. I think the.
For schema.
Yeah.
Let's
So
schema.
loads.
That's using the PG database session thing.
Cool. So going to localhost 3000.
Okay.
What's the login page? So I need to sign up first, right? Or is that a user already?
Why not on your computer?
No, you're at the.
So what's happening? Data. Okay, so right now I do not have any cookies on the page, right? Optimize the. So clear all cookies. Log in, and it created a user SID cookie. It didn't log me in though.
May have to do it again. We were having this thing where we were having to like save this session. Uh-oh.
And like your little message though, that's really cute.
So error occurred while creating users.create.
Do you have a different context database? Did you reset the database?
I ran load schema. Does that do it?
And where did it go to though?
Yeah, maybe.
Context development.
I feel like that should work.
Let's try again.
Yeah, hopefully there's not confirmed that it's like 100%.
So we're getting some sort of an error. So
Yeah, some kind of syntax error.
So let's look at it. So which file is that? Source models db users.
That might be the lowercase thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
there it is.
That's changed on my computer, but I guess I didn't put it up there.
But you did.
Maybe, or maybe it's in a branch. Yeah.
Oh, so interesting. So the cookie is actually set right in the beginning. So it creates a session ID, but there's no corresponding session associated to it. So that's how it works. Notice that even without logging in, it's created the user SID cookie. That's the first thing it does. So let's confirm by, yeah, let's delete this cookie. And let me refresh the page. Okay. Actually, no, only after logging in does that happen. Right, because my application is still empty. So sign up. Bar. Still.
Oh, you have a null value in the column admin. So
Oh, I see.
yeah.
Oh, that's another thing I fixed, sorry.
Yeah, so in the SQL,
Oh,
you
I
just
see.
change the value to the not null.
That is true.
Right.
Thank you. Sorry, I should probably fix my repo on GitHub.
Cool. So that created it. Still no cookie. So foo bar login. So that created it, and it redirected. So the redirected. So let's change the thing such that it does not redirect. So let's go back here. Server routes contacts. So which is the login? No, sorry, we want off. Where are your authentication routes? Yeah.
I think they're just an index in the
Gotcha.
top level routing thing.
Okay, so when we log in, we redirect to login. There you go. So we say save, and let's not redirect. Let's say vendor. Let's render the same page.
I don't think there's a user's login.
If that's what you're doing.
Oh, okay, sorry, yeah. Sorry, and the web page is not users, but yeah, and the client is.
And then let's just do the same thing. So message.
What is that req.session.save function?
Yeah, that's because they're using Postgres.
Okay.
The
Backend.
reason for that,
See, you were doing that.
we didn't have to have the request.session.save, but Chrome was doing some things faster, and so we were having to log in twice for some reason because it was like trying to render the page before.
But that makes sense because this is happening asynchronously because it has to save it in Postgres, and because it's not done, your middleware gets triggered again, and then you go to the thing, but then just let's go a millisecond later, it's
and then it would save in the database. So
right.
we had to put that in there so that it would actually save the session before it would try to render the next page.
Okay, so let's now do this. So now my application has this cookie in here, right? So I'm going to clear it out again. Go to the home page. It should go to the login because there is no cookie. Now if I log in, it renders the login page again. Right? But my network tab. So there was a post response header set cookie. Right, so the login response had a set cookie. So that means that in this function, that's where the header is being set, the cookie is being set.
Where's the?
So I think req.session. Whenever you modify the session, it automatically sets the header. That's what I think.
Okay. Where is the session?
So that's actually console log request.session. So maybe it's not really an object. It's like some sort of a funky thing that every time I modify it, something else is happening as well.
I was thinking that kind of like the way that body parser essentially creates the req.body. Like it's kind of almost seems like it's a similar thing where it makes req.session.
Okay, so The same thing, we got back this cookie. The request.session is the session object. Session. So it has a session ID in here. Headers. Okay, I guess the response doesn't contain the cookies that it's going to be sending.
Instead, you just call this function and assume that it has the whole genre and that extend it. I'm sorry, so here around
Session ID. Yeah, so it's probably happening somewhere in between those 2 points. It's happening in this function. So before I send back the response, so it's somehow happening with these 2 lines. So I guess if I comment out these 2 lines, I would not get the cookie.
And which thing makes the session exist without those? So what actually makes the session?
Still get a cookie,
It just won't have a session.
but it won't have a user data on it. I think it'll still have a SID because that's in the config.
But where is that? Oh, when you say request or session that's saved, I see.
Yeah,
When you
there's
say
like
request or
a,
session that's saved, that is.
if you go to the index, the server.js file, there's like some session config code.
Right. Just want to check this one thing. So log
So it
in.
wouldn't have the user data. Like the message.
Oh, did it not work?
No, it didn't create it.
Oh, maybe.
So it has a session, but it didn't create the cookie.
Oh, okay.
So if I just modify the session and I add any custom data in there, that I think creates a cookie. I mean, yeah. So let's see. Oh, actually, wait. No, it created the cookie. It's weird. I'm gonna try that again. So comment this out. Here's the cookie. Foo bar. Okay, so it didn't create the cookie.
But the moment you uncomment it out,
Right, so look at the login page. There was no set header in the response. I mean, set cookie in the response. So let's uncomment it out. Login. So there's no cookie. I think because I refreshed the page, it resubmitted the form. That's what happened.
okay.
So I have a foo and I have a bar. And I log in.
I guess
There it is. Yeah.
there has to be something in the session save function.
Yeah, or just modifying request session that triggers the creation of the cookie.
Wow.
So the session just kind of sort of gets created maybe by the middleware as you do request, but you, and then the cookie is when the session gets changed.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, this is like a deep dive, and I gotta prepare for my next meeting. So. But did that make sense? Like, try to, like, that's the only way to like figure things out is like hack around and like see what happens. Like get into the habit of like, you know, commenting stuff and seeing how it behaves. Cool. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Rabbit hole.
I don't like it. Other people do too.
It's always good to do the hacking part.